A man can stand in the middle of Jerusalem at noon, with the sun directly overhead, and watch the light go out. Not behind clouds, not the slow fade of evening coming on. The sun is at its highest point of the day, the city is jammed wall to wall with Passover pilgrims, smoke is rising from the altars, lambs are bleating in the temple courts, and then, in the space of a breath, darkness drops over the whole city like a lid coming down on a box. A man cannot see his own hand in front of his face. And here is the thing you need to hold on to from the very first second. This darkness is only the first of 7 things that are about to happen in the next few minutes. 7 signs, one after another, each one stranger than the last, all of them clustered around the death of a single man on a hill outside the city wall. And while that darkness lies over Jerusalem, something is happening that almost nobody in that crowd understands yet. Inside the temple, the priests are busy. It is Passover, the busiest day of their year. They are cutting the throats of lambs, thousands of them, draining the blood, doing the work their fathers did and their grandfathers before them, blood that could only ever point forward to something it could never accomplish. And less than half a mile away, on a low hill the Romans kept for executions, the one that every single one of those lambs had been pointing to for 1,500 years, is dying. The priest is sacrificing the symbol. The substance is bleeding out on a cross, and not one of them connects the two. So here is the spine of everything we are going to look at today, the idea I want you to carry with you all the way to the end. Everything that tore, everything that cracked, everything that went dark and shook and split open on that day, all of it moved in one single direction. From the inside out, from the top down, from God toward man. These were not special effects flickering around the death of a good teacher. This was the signature of God being pressed onto a document, and every one of these 7 signs is saying the same thing in a different language. The old way is closing. The door to God is opening, and the door was opened from the other side. Now, to feel the weight of any of this, you have to put yourself back into that city on that day, because the world of the first century was not the soft, sunlit world of the picture in your grandmother's Bible. Let me set the scene. We are somewhere around the year 31 of the Common Era, give or take. The emperor sitting on the throne in Rome is Tiberius, a suspicious and aging man who spent his final years hiding on an island and letting other people run his empire. The man Rome has stuck with the thankless job of governing Judea is a prefect named Pontius Pilate, a mid-level official whose entire career goal was probably to keep the locals quiet and not get a complaint letter sent back to Rome about him. And the place where all of this lands is Jerusalem at Passover, which is a very particular kind of chaos. On an ordinary day, the city held a certain number of people, but at Passover the population could swell several times over as pilgrims poured in from every direction, from Galilee, from the coast, from across the empire, all of them coming to sacrifice in the temple. Picture narrow stone streets packed shoulder to shoulder, the smell of roasting meat and burning incense and far too many people in one place, the constant noise of bleating animals and shouting vendors, and a dozen languages crashing into each other. The city was bursting at the seams, and at the centre of it stood the temple that Herod the Great had built, and it was genuinely one of the wonders of the ancient world. Gleaming white stone, so much gold on the facade that travellers said you could not look at it in direct sunlight without squinting. It was built in a series of courts, each one more restricted than the last, like a set of rings closing in toward a centre. There was a court where anyone, even a foreigner, could walk, then a court past which only Jewish people could go, then a court for the men, then one for the priests, and then, at the dead centre of it all, behind a massive curtain, a room that almost nobody on earth was ever allowed to enter, the Holy of Holies, the place where the presence of God was said to dwell. Into that room walked exactly one human being, exactly one time a year, on the Day of Atonement, and if he did it wrong, he did not come back out. The curtain that hung in front of that room, the veil, was not a bedsheet. According to Jewish tradition, it was enormous, stretching up many times the height of a man, and woven so thick, a handbreadth thick by some descriptions, that the old rabbis said horses tied to either side and driven in opposite directions could not tear it. It was a wall made of fabric. It said one thing to everyone who looked at it: you cannot come in. God is holy and you are not, and this curtain is the distance between the two of you. And outside that beautiful temple, in the harsh practical world of Roman power, stood the cross. We need to be honest about what Roman crucifixion actually was, because it was not the clean, tasteful image we have softened it into. It was not the neat white cloth and the gentle lighting of the Sunday school illustration. Crucifixion was a tool of terror, designed by the empire to be as public, as slow, and as humiliating as a human death could possibly be made. The Romans crucified people along busy roads on purpose, as a billboard that read, in effect, do not even think about defying Rome. The job of carrying it out fell to soldiers, overseen by a centurion, an officer who commanded around 80 men and who had almost certainly watched more people die than he could count. To him, this was a Friday. This was paperwork with blood on it. He had no idea that before the day was over, he was going to open his mouth and say something that would split his own life in two. That centurion, standing in his routine, is about to be interrupted, and so is everyone else in that city because the first of the 7 signs is already underway. The darkness. Let me be precise about it, because the timing matters enormously. The text in Matthew chapter 27 verse 45 tells us when it began and how long it lasted, and it sounds like this. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. In the way they kept time, the 6th hour was the middle of the day, what we would call noon, and the 9th hour was the middle of the afternoon, around 3. So put that together. The darkness did not come at dusk, when the light is already fading and the eye half expects it. It came at high noon, the exact moment when the sun should have been at its strongest, and it held for 3 full hours. The brightest part of the day went black and stayed black through the entire span of the crucifixion. And almost immediately someone will say, well, that is just an eclipse. A solar eclipse, the moon sliding in front of the sun. It is a tidy explanation, and it falls apart the moment you look at the calendar. Passover is fixed to the full moon. Every single year, by the way the Jewish calendar works, Passover lands when the moon is full, which means the moon is on the opposite side of the earth from the sun, and a solar eclipse can only happen at a new moon, when the moon passes directly between the earth and the sun. You cannot have a solar eclipse at full moon. It is astronomically impossible. It would be like trying to schedule a sunset for the same instant as a sunrise. Whatever put out the light over Jerusalem that afternoon, it was not the gears of the solar system grinding through their normal cycle. The natural explanation is the one explanation the date will not allow. So the darkness was a sign, and to understand what it was saying, you have to know the language it was speaking, the language of the Hebrew prophets. The Greek word the Gospel writers reach for here is skotos, and skotos does not simply mean the absence of light, the way we might describe a power outage. In the world of the prophets, darkness was the visible shape of God's judgment. It was the colour of the day of the Lord. Listen to the prophet Amos writing centuries earlier, in Amos chapter 8 verse 9. And it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord God, that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day. Read that again, and feel the chill of it. The sun going down at noon, the earth darkened in the clear day. Amos wrote those words roughly 760 years before that Friday, and they read like a weather report for the crucifixion. The darkness was not nature having a strange afternoon. It was the day of judgment arriving, and arriving early, and landing in one specific place. And that is the heart of what the darkness means, and it is almost too much to take in. The judgment that should have fallen on the whole world, the darkness that the prophets said would come for human sin, came down and concentrated itself on a single point. It gathered itself like a storm and broke over one man hanging on a cross. He was not dying in the dark to hide what was happening. He was in the dark because the judgment of the world was being poured out on him, and the light of God's face was being withdrawn from him, so that it would never have to be withdrawn from you. And it is out of that darkness, near the end of those 3 hours, that the second sign comes. Not something you can see, something you can hear, a cry. Jesus, who has been mostly silent through the whole ordeal, cries out in a loud voice, and the words come out in Aramaic, the everyday language of his childhood. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? People have wrung their hands over that cry for 2,000 years, and some have tried to soften it, but I think the most important thing about it is the most easily missed. He was quoting. Those are the opening words of Psalm 22, written by David 1,000 years before. Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And in that culture, when a rabbi quoted the first line of a psalm, he was pointing his hearers to the whole thing. So go and read where that psalm goes. It begins in abandonment and it travels line by line, toward a stunning declaration of victory and a promise that all the ends of the earth will turn to God. The cry from the cross was not the sound of a man losing his faith. It was a man, in the deepest darkness a human being has ever entered, reaching for the exact words of Scripture and pointing everyone listening toward the ending that the psalm already knew was coming. And then, with his strength nearly gone, he says one more thing, and in the Greek of John's Gospel it is a single word. John chapter 19 verse 30. It is finished. The word is tetelestai. And this is a word worth slowing down for, because we hear it finished and we instinctively think it means it is over, the way you might say a thing is ruined or done for. That is the opposite of what it carried. Tetelestai was a commercial word, an accounting word. Archaeologists have dug up business receipts and tax documents from the ancient world with this very word stamped across them, and it meant paid in full. It was the word you wrote on a bill when the entire debt had been settled, and there was nothing left owing. So when Jesus says tetelestai, he is not gasping it is all over. He is announcing with his last clear breath that the account is closed. The debt is settled. There is nothing left to pay. It is the stamp pressed across the bill of every wrong thing you have ever done, paid in full. And the moment that word leaves his mouth, the second sign ends and the third one is about to tear the temple in half. And it does tear in the very same instant. Matthew puts the two things side by side so we cannot miss the connection. Matthew chapter 27 verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. The moment the debt is declared paid, the curtain that guarded the presence of God rips open. And I need you to notice the detail Matthew slips in, because the whole meaning of this video hangs on 4 small words, from the top to the bottom. Think about that for a second. That curtain stretched up many times the height of a tall man. If you wanted to tear it, and you somehow could, you would grab it at the bottom where your hands could reach, and you would pull down, and it would tear from the bottom up. That is the only way a human being could possibly do it. But this veil tore from the top down, from a height no person could reach, starting up where only God's own hand could start it, and running downward to the floor. Matthew is not giving us a stitching report. He is telling us whose hand did this. No priest touched it. No earthquake is even mentioned yet as the cause. It split from the top, which is to say it split from heaven, which is to say God reached down and tore open the thing that had kept people out, and he tore it from his side, not ours. The Greek word for that curtain is katapetasma, and the word itself paints the picture. It comes from the idea of something that spreads out and hangs down to cover, to screen off, to divide. That was the entire job of the katapetasma, to divide. To stand between a holy God and an unholy people and say, this far and no farther. For roughly 1,500 years that curtain had done its work. It hung in front of the room they called the Holy of Holies, and inside that room, in the days of the first temple, sat the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark was a lid of solid gold. That lid has a name too, and it is one of the most beautiful words in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is the kapareth. We usually translate it the mercy seat, and the root of the word carries the idea of covering, of atonement, of a price that covers over a debt. Here is why it matters. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would carry blood behind the curtain and sprinkle it onto the kapareth, and the symbolism was staggering. Inside the ark, underneath that golden lid, were the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments, the perfect standard that every human being had broken. The law sat there accusing, and the blood was sprinkled on the cover above it, so that when God looked down he saw, not the broken law accusing the people, but the blood covering it over. That little golden lid was the one spot in the universe where the justice of God and the mercy of God met and did not destroy each other. Judgment underneath, mercy on top, blood in between. And now we have to be very careful and very clear, because this is exactly the point where people get confused about the law, when that curtain tore what ended and what did not. Because there is not one kind of law in the Bible. There are 2, and the Bible itself keeps them separate. There is the moral law, the 10 Commandments, spoken by God's own voice out of the fire on Mount Sinai, and written by God's own finger on tablets of stone. That law is a portrait of God's character. It is what love looks like spelled out. It tells you that you should not lie, should not steal, should not murder, should not push God out of the center of your life. That law did not expire on Friday afternoon. The character of God does not get torn in half. Theft did not become acceptable at 3 o'clock. The moral law stands because God stands. But there was a second kind of law, the ceremonial law, and this one was different from the start. It was not thundered from the mountain in God's voice. It was written by Moses in a separate book, and that book was placed beside the ark, not inside it. The law inside the ark was the unchanging character of God. The law beside the ark was the system of sacrifices and feasts and temple rituals, and every single piece of it was a finger pointing forward. The lambs pointed forward. The Day of Atonement pointed forward. The blood on the mercy seat pointed forward. They were the training wheels, the shadow cast on the ground by something that had not yet arrived. And the book of Hebrews says it without flinching. Hebrews chapter 10 tells us that the blood of bulls and goats could never actually take away sins. It could only cover them, year after year, a payment that always had to be made again. So when the substance finally arrives, what happens to the shadow? It dissolves. When the true lamb is sacrificed, what happens to the symbolic lambs? They have done their job, and their job is over. That is what tore in the temple. Not the moral law, the ceremonial system, the whole machinery of curtains and blood and a high priest going in once a year on your behalf. All of it was a placeholder, and the placeholder ripped open the second the real thing was finished. The writer of Hebrews stands there at the torn curtain and practically shouts the good news. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he hath consecrated for us, through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. Read that slowly. The veil, he says, was his flesh. When the body of Jesus was torn open, the curtain was torn open, because they were always the same thing. The door into the presence of God runs straight through him. And here is the part that should stop you in your tracks, wherever you happen to be sitting right now. For 1,500 years there was one man who could go in, one day a year, with blood that did not really work, into a room you would never see. And in one afternoon, all of that was replaced by a Saviour who is himself the high priest, who walked in once with his own blood, which works completely, and who left the door standing open behind him so that you could follow him in. Not a priest on your behalf. You, the ordinary you. Hebrews calls it boldness, the freedom to simply walk up to God like a child walking into a parent's room. If this is helping you see that afternoon in a way you have not seen it before, would you do one small thing? Share it with somebody who needs to hear that the door is open for them too. Subscribe, leave a comment, pass it along to one friend. That curtain tore so that the way in would be open to everyone, and honestly, this is just one more small way of holding it open. Thank you for being here with me in this. So the curtain is down, the way is open, and the meaning of the whole day is now on the table. But God is not finished pressing his signature onto the page. Because the moment that veil ripped from top to bottom, the ground itself began to move. The same verse that tells us the veil tore keeps going, because the two signs are happening in the same heartbeat. Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. The curtain splits, and the ground splits with it. The fabric tears, and the bedrock tears. Heaven reaches down to open the temple, and the earth answers from below by cracking open in response. This is the fourth sign, and it is creation itself reacting to what is happening on that cross. The Greek word Matthew uses for the quaking of the earth is seismos. You already know that word, even if you did not realize it, because it is the root sitting underneath our word seismic, the word geologists use for the shaking of the planet. But Matthew is not filing a geological report. He is telling us that the physical world could not stay still while its own maker was dying inside it. The rocks are more honest than the crowd. The stones feel what the people standing on them refuse to feel. When the one who spoke the mountains into being hangs lifeless on a wooden beam, the mountains themselves shudder. And to feel the full weight of this, you have to go back to another mountain, a long time before. Go back to Mount Sinai. Roughly 1,500 years earlier, God came down onto that mountain to give the law to Israel, and the description of that day is terrifying. Exodus chapter 19, verse 18. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. There it is again. The mountain quaked greatly. When God came down to give the law, the earth could not hold still. The ground trembled under the weight of his arrival. Now line the two scenes up next to each other, because they are speaking to each other across the centuries. At Sinai, Smoke and fire and a mountain shaking violently as the law is handed down, the law written on stone, the law that would sit inside the ark accusing everyone who broke it. And at Golgotha, darkness and a torn curtain and the earth shaking violently as that whole accusing system is brought to its appointed end. The same God, the same trembling ground. At Sinai the law arrives and the earth shakes because the standard has come and no one can meet it. At Golgotha, the one who met it perfectly pays the price for everyone who could not, and the earth shakes again. But this time the trembling is not the sound of a demand landing on us. It is the sound of a debt being lifted off of us. The first quake said, "Here is what holiness requires." The second quake said, "Here is the one who satisfied it." And there is something in the prophets that ties this together, because the shaking of the earth was always understood as the response of creation to the nearness of its maker. The prophet Nahum put it like this, Nahum chapter 1 verse 5, "The mountains quake at him, and the hills melt, and the earth is burned at his presence. The mountains quake at him." That is the whole point. The earth does not shake at random on this particular afternoon. It shakes because he is present, and because something enormous is being settled in his presence. The split rocks at the foot of the cross are the planet's own confession. They say with their stone voices that this is no ordinary execution of no ordinary man. And here is the detail I do not want you to walk past, because it points forward like an arrow. This is not the only earthquake in the story. Matthew records a second one just a couple of days later, on the morning of the resurrection, when an angel descends and rolls the stone away from the empty tomb, and the earth shakes again. So bracket the whole event with tremors. One earthquake when he dies, splitting the rocks, opening the way. A second earthquake when he rises, rolling back the stone, opening the grave. The first quake cracks the world open to let the old order out. The second quake cracks the tomb open to let the new life in. And between those two trembling moments, everything that the human race had been waiting for since the gates of Eden closed behind us quietly changed forever. So now we have darkness, and a cry, and a torn curtain, and a shaking earth. 4 signs, each one louder than the last in its own way, each one saying the door is opening and the old wall is coming down. And you might think that would be the climax, that creation could not possibly do anything stranger than crack its own bedrock in two. But the most mysterious of all 7 signs is the one that comes next, because in the next moment the ground does not just split, the graves do. The same passage in Matthew finishes the thought, and it finishes it with the strangest sentence in the entire crucifixion account. Matthew chapter 27 verses 52 and 53. "And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many." Read that twice, because most people read it once and quietly decide not to think about it. The tombs around Jerusalem split open at the moment of the earthquake, and bodies of holy people who had died came back to life and walked into the city and were seen by many witnesses. This is the 5th sign, and it is the one that makes people uncomfortable, partly because it is so strange and partly because it gets read carelessly. So let us slow down and read it carefully, because when you read it carefully it stops being a horror story and becomes one of the most hopeful sentences in the Bible. First, notice the word Matthew uses for what these people were doing before this happened. He says they slept, the bodies of the saints which slept. That is not a soft euphemism Matthew invented to be polite about death. It is the consistent language of the entire Bible. The Greek word is koimaomai, and it simply means to fall asleep, to be sleeping. And here is a detail you will never unsee once you have seen it. Our word cemetery comes straight from this Greek root. A cemetery, in the original sense of the word, is a sleeping place, a dormitory for the dead. The early Christians named their burial grounds with the same word you would use for a bedroom because they did not believe death was the end of a person. They believed it was sleep, a rest, a pause before the morning. This matters enormously for how we read what happened that afternoon, because the Bible is consistent about what death is for the believer. It is sleep, and it is sleep that ends at one specific event, the resurrection, when Jesus returns and the dead in Christ rise. Jesus himself said it. John chapter 11 verse 25. "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." He did not say believers skip death and float off somewhere on their own. He said he is the resurrection. The hope is not that we escape the sleep. The The hope is that he wakes us from it. So how do we understand these saints who came out of the tombs? Look at the order of events that Matthew is so careful to give us, because the order is everything. The tombs split open at the moment Jesus died on Friday, but Matthew tells us plainly that the people did not come out and walk into the city until after his resurrection. There is a gap. The graves crack open on Friday as a sign, but the bodies do not rise and appear until after Sunday morning, after Jesus himself has risen. And that is not a small detail, that is the whole theology of it sitting right there in the timeline, because the Apostle Paul gives us the rule that makes sense of all of it. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 20. But now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the first fruits of them that slept. The first fruits. That was a farming word and a temple word. The first fruits were the very first sheaf of the harvest, brought in and lifted up before God as a promise, a guarantee that the whole field was coming behind it. Christ is the first fruits. He is the first one to rise from the dead, never to die again, and his rising is the promise that the entire harvest of his people will follow. So the order had to be what it was. Christ must be first. The first fruits cannot come up after the rest of the field. So these saints wait, even in the strange in-between of that weekend, and they do not come out until the first fruits has gone up before them. They are not an exception that breaks the rule. They are the rule put on display. They are the first handful of the harvest, raised right behind the one who had to go first, paraded through the streets of Jerusalem as living proof of what his death had just purchased. They are a preview, a trailer for the resurrection morning that is still coming for everyone who sleeps in him. And if you want to see where Matthew got the image, go back to the prophet Ezekiel and the valley of dry bones. Ezekiel chapter 37. God sets the prophet down in a valley full of dry, scattered, hopeless bones, the picture of a dead and buried people, and God asks him, can these bones live? And then the breath of God comes, and bone joins to bone, and flesh comes upon them, and a vast army of the dead stands up alive. For centuries that was a vision, a promise on paper, and on that weekend outside Jerusalem for the first time in history, the dry bones actually stood up. The vision walked out of the page and into the streets. And here is the quiet detail that I find almost unbearably beautiful, sitting right in the middle of that weekend. While all of this is set in motion, the body of Jesus is lying still in a borrowed tomb, and the day it lies there, fully, from evening to evening, is the seventh day, the Sabbath. Think about what that means. At the very beginning, in the very first week, when the work of creation was done, the Maker rested on the seventh day and made it holy, and he did that before there was any sin, before there was any nation of Israel, before there was a single covenant or commandment given to anyone. The rest was built into the world itself, and now, at the end of the greatest work he would ever do, the work of redemption, the Maker rests again on that same seventh day in the silence of a tomb. The work of the first creation finished, and he rested. The work of the new creation finished, paid in full, and he rested. The same day, the same holy pause. The Creator keeping Sabbath in the grave while the harvest he just purchased waits in the ground for the morning. So the graves are open, the first fruits is about to rise, and the dead are about to walk. Creation has spoken from the sky, from the temple, from the bedrock, and now from the graveyard. But there is one voice left that has not spoken yet, a human voice, and it is going to come from the last person in that entire crowd you would ever expect. Remember the centurion, the professional, the man who came to work that morning expecting another ordinary execution, who had watched more people die than he could count, who looked at the cross the way you might look at a spreadsheet, just another task to get through before the end of the shift. He is the last man in Jerusalem you would expect to say anything at all about God. He serves the empire that is killing this prisoner. He is a foreigner, a pagan, a man whose whole career was built on Roman power and Roman gods. And he is the one who speaks the sixth sign, Matthew chapter 27 verse 54. Now when the centurion, and they that were with him, watching Jesus, saw the earthquake, and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly this was the Son of God. Truly this was the Son of God. Sit with the fact that those words come out of that mouth. The official representative of Caesar, standing at the foot of the cross with blood on his hands, looks at a dead Jewish carpenter and says out loud, in front of his own soldiers, that this man was the Son of God. The Greek phrase is huios theou, Son of God, and here is what makes it land like a thunderclap. In that world, huios theou was a title that belonged to Caesar. The emperor in Rome was the one called Son of a God. the one whose coins carried that claim, the one whose divinity Roman soldiers were sworn to honour. And this Roman soldier takes the highest title his own empire reserved for its emperor and lays it down at the feet of an executed man. He is committing something close to treason with a single sentence. He has spent the day surrounded by the signs, the darkness, the cry, the earth shaking under his boots, and somewhere in those 3 dark hours the hardest heart on the hill cracked open like the rocks did. And there is one more thing happening underneath this that you cannot miss. Earlier, while they were driving the nails, Jesus had prayed. Luke records it. Luke chapter 23 verse 34. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgive them. He prayed that over the very men holding the hammers. And who was standing right there, supervising those men, close enough to hear every word? The centurion. So watch the arc of that single afternoon. Jesus prays, Father, forgive them. And before the sun has fully returned, one of them, the officer in charge of the whole grim business, is confessing that the man he just helped to kill is the Son of God. The prayer did not bounce off the sky. It landed in the heart of the soldier standing closest to the cross. The first answer to the prayer forgive them was the man who had the most to be forgiven for. And then comes the 7th sign, and it is the quietest of them all, because it is not in the sky, or the ground, or the temple. It is in the faces of the crowd. Luke chapter 23 verse 48. And all the people that came together to that sight, beholding the things which were done, smote their breasts and returned. They beat their chests, the ancient gesture of grief and guilt, and they turned around and went home in silence. And do not forget who these people were. A crowd had stood in front of Pilate not many hours earlier and screamed for this. They had shouted, Crucify him, crucify him. They had chosen him for the cross, and now the same crowd walks away from that cross beating their own chests, undone, grieving, no longer triumphant. So look at the 2 human reactions side by side, because the whole question of that day, and of your life, is hidden in the contrast. The same signs fell on everyone. The same darkness covered the centurion and the crowd and the priests alike. The same earth shook under all their feet, and it softened some hearts, and it hardened others. The centurion saw the signs, and his heart broke open, and out came a confession. The religious leaders saw the very same signs, and as the Gospels go on to tell us, their first move after the Sabbath was to post a guard and seal the tomb, to try to keep the dead man dead. Same evidence, opposite responses. The cross does not leave anyone neutral. It is a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples reach every person standing on the shore, and every person has to decide which way they will lean, toward the open door or away from it. And the soft hearts won in the end, because this is not where the story stops. Hold on to that crowd beating their chests and walking home, because some of them are going to be back. Just over 7 weeks later, on the day of Pentecost in that same city, the followers of this same Jesus will stand up and preach that the man the crowd crucified has been raised from the dead. And the Bible tells us what happened to the listeners, Acts chapter 2 verse 41. Then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. 3,000. Many of them surely from the very crowd that had stood at Calvary. The chest-beating turned into repentance. The grief turned into faith. The door that tore open that Friday started filling up with people walking through it. So that is the 7th sign. The hardest heart on the hill confessing, and the guilty crowd turning home in sorrow that would become salvation. 7 signs now, complete. And to feel the full weight of what they all mean, I want to take you to one specific room, at one specific moment, and show you the whole thing through the eyes of a single man who never saw the cross at all. So come with me into the temple, into the moments around 3 in the afternoon, and stand next to a priest who has no idea what is happening half a mile away. He is doing his job. It is Passover, the busiest day of the year, and he has done this 1,000 times. His hands know the work without his mind. The smell of blood and smoke is so familiar to him that he no longer notices it. There is the bleating, the press of the crowd in the courts outside, the heat, the routine. His back is to the great curtain, the way it almost always is, because the curtain is just there, the way a wall is just there, a fact of the building he stopped seeing years ago. Behind it is the room no one enters. In front of it is his whole life of service. He lifts the knife. He's reaching for another lamb, one more in an endless line of lambs, blood that he has been taught his entire life can cover the sins of the people for one more year. And then he hears it, a sound that does not belong in that room, a tearing, cloth ripping, but cloth heavier than any cloth he's ever touched, and the sound is wrong because it is coming from above him, from up near the ceiling, from a height no hand can reach. He turns, and he watches the curtain that has stood between him and the presence of God for his entire life, the curtain that thick, that tall, that holy, splitting down its centre from the top, the two halves falling away from each other, and behind it, the thing he was never, ever supposed to see. The Holy of Holies, open, exposed, and it is empty, and it is silent, and the way in is simply, suddenly, there. He is standing there with a lamb's blood on his hands and a knife in his grip, in the middle of offering a sacrifice that has just, in that instant, become unnecessary, and he does not know it yet. He does not know that 1/2 mile away, on a hill outside the wall, the true lamb has just bowed his head and said it is finished. He is killing the symbol at the exact moment the substance dies. He is doing the old work as the old work ends. The thing he gave his life to maintain has just been finished by someone else, finished completely, finished forever, and the torn curtain in front of him is God's own announcement that he can put the knife down. There is no need to do this again. Not next year, not ever. The blood he is spilling could only ever point forward, and the one it pointed to has arrived and paid the whole price. Once. For all time. And the curtain hangs in 2 pieces, and the room behind it is open, and the air in that holy place for the first time in the history of the world is just air, because the God who lived behind the veil has gone out to meet his people on the other side. Now go back with me to where we started, back to the darkness, back to that man standing in the street at high noon watching the light drain out of the sky, unable to see his own hand. We asked, at the beginning, what put out the sun on a day when an eclipse was impossible, and now you know. The darkness did not come to hide a defeat. It was not God looking away in shame from a failed Messiah. The darkness came down because the judgment of the whole world was being gathered into one place and poured out on one person, and that kind of judgment is too terrible to happen in the light. The sun went out the way the lights go down in a theatre right before the most important scene, so that every eye would be forced onto the one place where everything was being decided, and then, at 3 p.m, when the price was paid in full and the curtain was torn and the debt was settled, the light came back. Of course it came back. The judgment was over. The morning was on its way. The darkness was never the end of the story. It was the cover under which the most important work in the history of the universe was finished, and when the work was done, the sun came out again over a world that would never be the same. So here is what all 7 of these signs are saying, every one of them in its own voice. The sky going dark, the cry from the cross, the curtain torn from the top down, the earth split open, the graves giving up their sleepers, the soldier confessing, the crowd turning home in tears. They are all saying one thing: the way to God is open, and a human being did not open it. It tore from the top, it cracked from below, it moved from the inside out and from heaven down to earth, every single time. Because this was never something we climbed up to reach. It was something God came down and tore open from his side. The old system is closed and the new and living way is thrown wide, and no one can shut it again. And that means something for you, wherever you are sitting right now, whatever you carried into this video, whatever you are quietly afraid is too heavy to ever be forgiven. You do not have to fight your way back to God. You do not have to find the right ritual, or be holy enough first, or wait for some priest to go in on your behalf and hope it works. The curtain is already torn, the door is already open, and it was opened from the other side, by a hand you could never have reached. You're not standing outside a locked wall pounding to be let in. You're standing in front of an open door that was torn open for you, and all that is left to do is walk through it. If this study has meant something to you today, the most genuine way you can help is simple. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Leave a comment. Even a single word is enough to help others find this, and send it to one person you think needs to hear that the door is open for them too. And if you would, please keep us in your prayers the way we are praying for the people on the other side of this screen. The curtain is torn from top to bottom, the price is paid in full, the way home is open, and it is open for you. May the God who tore it open draw you through it, and may the peace of the risen Christ rest on you and stay with you. God bless you.